Hello, everybody. Our speaker this evening is Dr. David Barber, a photo historian and member of the RPS Historical Group. He has a research interest in photographers from the northeast of England. In 2023, he shared his discoveries with us about the early years of W&D Downey of Newcastle upon Tyne, court photographers to Queen Victoria and the royal family. Tonight's talk is about the Newcastle photographer Ursula Clark. It marks the 25th anniversary of her death. Her archive of 20,000 largely black and white negatives is the largest by any woman held by Historic in England. So we should get a very interesting insight. Anyway, over to you, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Gilly. Good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for joining this talk on a Friday evening at this time. It's a real privilege for me to be able to present this talk and share with you new research and lots of images by a photographer who a year ago I had not heard of, Ursula Clark. Let me just give you a little bit of an insight, and this is often for researchers, how you come across a story. This is a reconstruction of a scene that confronted myself and my wife when we were on a second-hand book tour and visit. And this, if you can look at the spine with the white arrow, this is a book that was entitled Historic Architecture of Newcastle upon Tyne. And it was just sort of caught my wife's eye because she's from the northeast and we've lived up here for a while. And from there, I just opened the book. And this was the first image I came across. It's one of Newcastle's typical chairs. These are alleyways around the river up into the town. And I just thought, oh, it's a great shot. You know, and they also have fantastic names: Dog Leap Stairs, Breakneck Stairs, Pudding Chair. And then I opened up a bit further into the book and was confronted with this double-page spread. Again, when you're familiar with Newcastle, the scene on the left and the extreme left, you can see the lantern tower of Newcastle Cathedral. And I just thought, well, these are great photographs. And then just sort of trying to find out more about who'd taken the photographs. These are the credits I was confronted with. So apart from two, one of them, John R. Edis, is a well-known Durham photographer. There's currently a PhD research project into that photographic practice. But all of the photographs by Ursula Clark. Who is Ursula Clark, I thought. So I put Ursula Clark photographer into Google, and it took me here to Historic England site, an archive collection of 20,000 black and white negatives taken by her. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then when you go to the page in the Historic England site, some images of Ursula's confront you. So my appetite was hugely whetted by what I was seeing. And I thought I need to find out more about this photographer. So I made a trip to Historic England's archive in Swindon. And this is her archive in these rather unexciting grey boxes, which will be familiar to people who work in archives. But within them, some unbelievable treasures. And that's really the theme of the talk this evening, is to share those with you and just to share my enthusiasm and passion for the work of Ursula Clark. And I think are perhaps undervalued and in terms of her significance for photographic history. So my talk this evening will cover a number of areas. I'm going to start with some family history. I'll then move on to talk about Ursula's work for Oriel Press, a Newcastle upon Tyne publisher through the 60s and 70s. I'll then look in more detail at images from Ursula's collection. And I'll conclude by just looking really at perhaps aspects of Ursula's photography that are not as well known because they're not tied in with the architectural photography she did, the buildings that she captured over that period. So we're starting really with who is Ursula Clark? And I wanted to know more, and I didn't know anything about it at all. Historic England really were helpful in giving me a biography of her, brief biography, which told me that she was born on the 24th of February, 1940 at Gosforth Northumberland, and was educated at local schools. Gosforth is a suburb of Newcastle, so she was a Newcastle girl, and immediately my particular interest in Northeast photographers was aroused. So how far back did I have to go to find out more about her? Well, the answer was to actually into the middle of the 19th century. This is a photograph taken from the Gateshead side of the River Tyne, looking into Newcastle, and you can see on the extreme left again the lantern tower of Newcastle Cathedral, St Nicholas Church as it was then. This is the high level bridge which was built across the river 1846, the later part of the 1840s, and was opened by Queen Victoria in 1850. If you've travelled on the East Coast rail line, you'll have crossed it and have got the great view of the River Tyne. So there we are in the middle of the 19th century, and I found a newspaper advert in the Newcastle Journal, 22nd of May 1847, for Thomas Clark, who's billed as a manufacturer of plain and fancy cutlery and a surgical instrument and truss maker. This Thomas Clark was Ursula's great-great-grandfather, and a shop in Mosley Street, and by appointment. So this was a shop with a certain degree of quality about it. You didn't just rock up there of your own devices. And the Thomas Clark business continued with his son, who was called Robert Clark. And here we are half a century later, and Robert Clark, his son, still involved with cutlery and being an optician, still doing the truss making and the surgical instrument work. But the bit from my point of view that was interesting was photographic apparatus is part of what he's doing. Best quality, low prices, and this is the sort of thing that Robert Clark was offering. So the camera on the left, I'd be really interested to hear from anybody who knows more about the sort of camera it is and what it could do. But you can see there was actually a nameplate that went onto the camera, which is great. And on the right, a typical brochure offering optical lanterns and slides, which around 1900 were starting to become very, very popular, fantastic form of entertainment. We're going to be superseded fairly soon by moving pictures, but still were popular long into the 20th century as a way of entertaining people, illustrated talks and so on. Go to 1906, and this is a London Gazette business announcement, which shows that John Robert Clark, so Robert Clark has now passed on the business to his son, and a partnership that he had with a chap called George Peacock's coming to an end. But there we are, John Robert Clark. So this is Ursula's great-grandfather taking on the business. And as we see in this photograph on the left, his shop had a pretty prominent position in Granger Street. Now they've moved, and the business is thriving. And in Ward's directory on the right there, you'll see still cutler and optician, surgical instrument and truss maker to the Royal Infirmary. Obviously, pre-National Health Service were a really important hospital in the city. But the photography side of it seems to have slightly disappeared. And then I found an obituary for John Robert Clark, 1937. He dies at the age of 74. The week before, the paper tells us he was still at work at the business. And the significant part here is in the bottom paragraph where we read that Mr. Clark followed his father, Mr. Robert Clark, in the business, and his own son has in turn been associated with him in it for a long time. And that son is this chap, Joseph William Clark. This is Ursula's father. And as you can see from the dates, he was born in 1889, lived to be nearly 100, and that's Ursula's father. From the business point of view, another business was part of Ursula's family background on her mother's side. So there's it's Bainbridge's, a very familiar name in terms of a store, part of the later part of the John Lewis partnership. As you can see from this drawing, they were a big operation, and they were very important in the city, a really important brand and name, and you could go to Bainbridge's and pretty much get anything you wanted in Newcastle. And this is Ursula's grandfather on her mother's side. This is Ralph Hunter Riddle. I found an obituary for him, which reveals that he'd worked for Bainbridge's for 40 years, 30 as chief accountant in the retail section. So we've got a fantastic link up really between two families with strong business links in the city of Newcastle. So we have Joseph William Clark, and Ursula's mum was Mildred Riddle. So Mildred had trained as a physiotherapist, which she kept in that line of work after the couple married in 1939, just before the war broke out. And Ursula Mary Clark appears the following year. So that's Ursula's family history, which in the context of what she went on to do is pretty significant. These were a couple of photographs from her archive, which show that she had a great awareness of where her family roots were. The left-hand photograph is along Granger Street. You'll see in the far distance, if you know Newcastle, Gray's Monument, and the arrow there shows where the Robert Clark business was, which her father still worked in right through to the mid-1950s. On the right, you'll just catch a little glimpse there of the Bainbridge's sign, part of the business there. So links with her mother's family. Her mother seems to have lived quite an interesting life before she met Ursula's father. And one of the things she did was she lived in some really quite fantastic buildings in Newcastle. So the building on the left is called Lees's Terrace. It'll be known to people who are familiar with Newcastle United's ground, St James's Park. It's next to St James's Park and has been one of the reasons why St James's Park hasn't been expanded beyond a certain level on part of the ground, is because Lees's Terrace in there, a really historic part of the building of Newcastle in the 19th century. So Ursula's mum lived there for a while. And then the building on the right is another building she lived in before she got married, which is Bessie Surtees' house. This is a building that goes back to Tudor times. And she lived there. And one of the things she would have seen from where she lived at Bessie Surtees' house, this is the roof of Bessie Surtees' house, looking across to the Tyne Bridge, which was built in the late 1920s. And so by the time she lived there in the mid to late 30s, it was already established part of the Newcastle skyline. So we pick up really with Ursula now. Her teens and her upbringing, I can't really give you any information about, apart from the fact that she seems to have picked up the photography bug. It was in her blood from her mid-teens. And by the time she was 18, 1958, she joined the Department of Photography at what was called King's College, Durham University, as a photographic assistant. And despite the Durham University tag, that part of the university was actually in Newcastle and stayed there when Newcastle University became an independent organization in 1962-63. So she worked there for a period of time. And again, I can't really give you any further information on that, apart from the fact that it was a vibrant department, was led by some really interesting and innovative people. And she obviously learned a lot about the business of photography. Now, a key person in Ursula's story is the chap on the left, Bruce Alsop, Professor Bruce Alsop. And as you can see from his dates, he was considerably older than Ursula. He was born in 1912 and had a career in architecture which straddled either side of the Second World War. He served in the Second World War. His architecture career took in Leeds before he came up to Newcastle. He was a fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. He was a founding member of the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain. And he's worthy of a talk in his own right, a really fascinating figure. I think it's fair to say something of a Renaissance man and somebody who had lots and lots of ideas way beyond just architecture. He wrote novels and he had all sorts of irons in the fire, which another talk would do justice to. But he was also a really accomplished photographer. The architecture department that's seen on the right there, this is a photograph that Ursula took, was right in the middle of the campus at the top of Northumberland Street, which in those days was the A1. So the A1 came right the way through Newcastle city centre. Bruce's big idea that he wanted to get off the ground was Oriel Press. And Oriel Press, he had the idea of having an independent publishing company that would be independent of London publishers who dominated the market, and would be a platform really for ideas of his own, but also other ideas that might come to him that perhaps didn't get a favourable hearing in London. And so Oriel Press, he set up in July 1962, an address in Ridley Place, which we'll come on to in a second. So Ridley Place was actually off Northumberland Street. So people, as they drove up the A1, would go past the end of the street. He was working as a lecturer in the university at this point. And so this was really like a side project, a side hustle, I think it would be called nowadays. Historic England's biography of Ursula then tells us that Ursula was invited to join the company, that's Oriel, as photographic editor, and was therefore able to combine her experience in photography with an existing interest in architecture, which obviously is a really pertinent way of finding our way into Oriel as a company. I went on a little pilgrimage a few weeks ago, and the building on the left is 27 Ridley Place, which was where Oriel's offices were. As you can see, it's a lovely brick building at the end of a terrace. Today, it's a pizza restaurant, takeaway pizza. And then on the other side of the road, directly opposite with the Ridley Place sign on the right, is a much more substantial building that Oriel used later, and I'll come on to that, which is today a university hall of residence for students at Newcastle University. So there were links with the university, even in the buildings that they were using for offices. This is Ridley Place today, and I went on a little visit really to see if I could sort of locate a photograph that Ursula took. So if you look at the arrow at the top of the right-hand part of this shot, which is at the roof line, and then I will just mix through to a shot here that Ursula took. So this is Ridley Place, probably in the sort of late 60s. Partly I'm showing it because of the fact that you'll see in the center shot is Bacon's cameras. So Bacon's was a photographer's and camera shop that dated back to the 19th century, like her own family business. And it was handily placed. She got film from there, she got equipment, and it was ideal, really. The bus stop queue here is almost like an example of a photography where she's doing architecture, which is what's in the background, but she's also capturing a bit of social history, really. And I'm sure if we spend a bit more time looking at this photograph, you'll see people, there's a couple of guys with briefcases, there's a schoolgirl, there is somebody in a fantastic wet look coat, which my mother had one of those and was much prized. So she was sort of had an eye on other things at the same time as she was taking photographs of buildings. But the first project that Bruce Alsop and Ursula Clark worked on together was called Architecture of France, which seems like a bit of a step away from Newcastle, but I think that was a gesture towards the ambition of the company. This was published in May 1963, and a bit of research has revealed that it coincided with the Beatles' first tour, where they were supporting Roy Orbison, and I think they played in Newcastle. So this would have been the talk of the town rather than possibly Architecture of France being published. But it was a really important moment in Ursula's life. This is the sort of explanation of what Oriel guides were about. They were guides to architecture based on the latest research. Intended for tourists, they're also useful to students of architecture and especially valuable for school parties going abroad. The contents list really gives you, this is the template of the books that they produced for the next 10, 15 years, where you get a map, you get a glossary of terms, you get some outline of the particular architecture of the subject of the book, in this case, France, and then it goes through a chronological series of periods, which are then illustrated by photographs. And this is really where Ursula came into the team that were producing these books. This is a handwritten note. Sorry, it's a little bit out of focus, but I was just using it for research at the time, but I realized later it was important that this is in Ursula's hand. It's France, and it shows top right that she was using 35mm film, and the majority of her archive is 35mm. There's some 120mm. And the other significant fact there beneath that, it says Ursula's Holiday, which perhaps gives you an indication of the slightly sort of low budget version of a publishing company, where they're doing this really within the context of holidays. And Bruce Alsop also took summer breaks and went with his camera to various places to take photographs. The left-hand column, the writing there shows Coutances Cathedral. So this is Coutances in Normandy, and in the Architecture of France book, this is the double pages. The one on the right gives us the page with Coutances Cathedral, and that gives you an example of Ursula's photography. The thing to bear in mind about these books is they are very small. They're 5 inches wide by 6.5 inches high. So they basically fit in the palm of my hand. People with smaller hands, it'd be a little bit less, but they're basically a pocket-sized guide to fit in a bag, a rucksack, a pocket. And so Ursula's challenge really was to fit her photographs into pages that were this small, but also needed some text. Here's another example where she's got 4 very small photographs, but they're very detailed. The one on the left, bottom left, is just a good example. This is a piece of architecture which is Romanesque, I think is the term, Pont du Gard from the Architecture of France book. And what she's managed to capture here is some French or tourists having a dip in the river. So the photographs often have this element beyond a purely architectural photograph. That's something I've noticed about her work. The press reaction was great. This is the Times Literary Supplement, an admirable new series, an intelligent choice of illustrations, attractively laid out, and is pointed by a terse and informative text. So the illustrations getting a particular mention there, which must have been heartening for Ursula in really a very early part of her life. She's only 23, 24 when the book comes out. As a result of the publication, we go then to 1964, and they follow up with 2 more books, Italy and England, and it's again a joint authorship. And here's a couple of pages from the England book, which perhaps gives you an indication of the slight regional bias of these guides, the Oriole guides. On the left-hand side, we've got Rothbury, Northumberland, Liverpool and Leeds. And then on the right-hand side, there's a bit of a nod with Westminster Central Hall, but we get Newcastle and Liverpool as well. So all in all, you've got a good selection of regional photographs as part of that mix. By this point, people within the architecture world were becoming aware of what Bruce Alsop was doing and wanted to be part of the publishing list. So John Glugg is a very well-known and respected writer on architecture and design. And this is the book that he produced, which had illustrations by Ursula and was published in 1965. A good example of how Ursula worked. The page on the left features the new Coventry Cathedral. This was completed in 1962. And the designs of Basil Spence. They've even, this is Bruce Alsop's concepts, I'm sure, the bottom left, you actually get a part of the layout of the new cathedral, which was built alongside the Gothic cathedral, which had been bombed during the Second World War. So it was quite an interesting sort of mix of Gothic and then modern architecture. The photograph on the right is a photograph that illustrates what Ursula would do. If you look at her negatives, there's sometimes you think, well, is that shot, what's she looking at there? The shot on it's cropped on the bottom left-hand side, and you can see almost like where she's drawn the lines to take in particular parts of the structure. And the modernist part of the Coventry Cathedral is obviously more evident in the tighter shot. The press in Newcastle were very helpful in that they covered what Oriole was doing. So you get glimpses into the world that Ursula was occupying. So this article from February 66 reveals that the working staff was a secretary administrator, a secretary, one artist, and two photographers. Mr. Alsop putting in what work he can alongside his job at the university. And the two photographers is interesting because obviously Ursula was one of the photographers, so another person who joined the staff. And there they are operating in the 27 Ridley Place address, very small rooms, but it's got files, a library, and a studio and darkroom with developing facilities. And in the pre-digital age, of course, typewriters. This is a book that appeared in 1966, and what A&C Black did was they pulled together the first three Oriole guides, which were covering France, Italy, and England, and added a guide that was published that year by Harold Boughton with Alsop and Clark's involvement on Spain. So those four texts were put together in a big, big book. Photographically, what's interesting, you'll notice on the front cover, you'll recognize Stonehenge at the top, and again, a regional perspective from Ursula at the bottom was the inclusion of Jesmond Branch Library. So this is her shot of Jesmond Branch Library. This is a suburb of Newcastle, a modernist building, circular, and it was designed by a company who are still based in Newcastle now, Faulkner Browns, and it was designed in the round. It's now a grade 2 listed building, and it was really a way, I suppose, of a nod to the fact that the history of architecture was absolutely developing at a pace in both Britain and across Europe in this early 60s period, as architects got to grips with the fact that much of the landscape had been bombed, and those bits that hadn't been were perhaps in a state of disrepair or needed replacing, and modernist architects had ideas about how the landscape could look. Here's a review from the Scotsman, just highlighting the fact in this book that there were 700 photographs. So it's a visually rich experience, which Ursula was pretty integral to creating. The bigger page format meant that the photographs, which are tiny in the Oriole guide, suddenly get some space and detail is visible. So this is a double page or 2 pages from the book, which I'll just let you enjoy because the detail that is captured there is fantastic. Where these photographs were taken from in terms of health and safety forms, goodness only knows, but they're very effective. And I think a good head for heights was obviously called for. Another press interview I found actually is with Ursula. So she's regarded, called here Miss Clark. So this was following up that particular book. There was another book which was about to come out, which I'll tell you about in a second. So the new book had 200 photographs in that were taken by Ursula and Bruce Alsop. And Ursula's quoted as saying, "I have been to France, Italy, Spain, and the Benelux countries," she says, and Mr. Alsop has been to many others. So it is very much a collaborative photographic venture, this. I wouldn't want to give the impression that Ursula was doing all the photography. She clearly contributed considerably, but she was also very aware it was a collaborative venture. This is the book she was doing the press interview for, which is called Photography for Tourists. And by this point in Oriole's history, they clearly had realized that there was a market for just the basics of taking photographs. And they were obviously getting feedback by that. I include this shot of St. Mary's Island, which is at Whitley Bay for sentimental reasons, and this is where my wife was brought up. But what's interesting is this particular shot, she said to me, well, that's been taken from an unusual angle. Normally you get shots of St. Mary's from the coast or along the causeway. This one, if taken by Ursula, she's wandered out into where the sea would be, and at low tide has taken a shot that way. But it's been taken with a Box Brownie camera, 1914, it says, on FP3 film. So there's a yellow filter is being used and it's held by sellotape. So this is all very high tech, but I think it's just making the point that photography is something that needs a bit of love, and also that you can experiment with it and produce good results. So I think the tone of that was deliberate, and they wanted to try and show that photography was an art form in many ways too. This is a double page spread from the book. Very much, I was trying to look for clues as to Ursula's cameras that she might have used. The 120 film that she includes in the archive, so a Hasselblad might have been a camera she used, but I think, you know, possibly we're talking about a straightforward reflex camera of some kind. But here the detail, they're very much trying to encourage people to, you get what you pay for is the tone of the text. So if you're going to buy a camera, make sure if you're going to spend a bit more money that you realize what you're getting. Another, just a little insight here, this photograph, it's not Ursula, I don't think. Doesn't seem to be the same person as in the photograph I showed you at the beginning of the talk, but it's somebody who's using a changing bag to change over a film. So this may be the other photographer who was mentioned earlier. It would be fantastic to get a name to this photographer if anybody can help with that. So at this point, Oriole Press, 1966, England have won the World Cup, all seems to be going great, and they're preparing a whole series of guides, and Ursula's mention of the Benelux countries is echoed there in some of the countries that guides are in preparation for. And the press are being told this as well, that there's hopes of expanding, and the idea of a big American deal is being talked about to break the London monopoly, so you can get this regional perspective on what they were doing. But that didn't happen. No American investor seems to have come forward. So the result was that they went looking on their own doorstep. And this is the first of a series of books that were produced by Oriole, Historic Architecture of Newcastle upon Tyne. This is the book that I found in the secondhand bookshop at the start of the talk. And what they did for investment was they went to local organizations. So the Northumberland and Newcastle Society is a conservation body, just celebrated its centenary. And the other sponsor was, ironically, Newcastle City Council, because this was a period when Newcastle, like many cities, was undergoing major transformation. Old buildings were being either demolished or removed. And the Northumberland Newcastle Society was very concerned about the changing shape of Newcastle and that really valuable old buildings were being lost. The City Council was, on the other hand, driving quite a considerable move towards changing the way Newcastle looked, of which more in a second. So this book was published in 1967. Ursula's photography would have been aware that W&D Downey, a century before, had been taking photographs in the city, and this is a carte de visite, which misleadingly in my collection is called St. Peter's. Somebody's written on it. Well, of course, it's St. Nicholas. So that is from the 1860s. In the 1960s, this is Ursula's shot of the same view. And it's interesting just to sort of see what buildings are still there. One of the things just relating to Newcastle United is you'll see on Ursula's shot the floodlight pylons in the top left-hand corner there. But it's pretty much, in terms of the church, is pretty much an unchanged scene. Downeys were based in Eldon Square, number 9 Eldon Square, which is in the sort of top right-hand corner there. And Eldon Square is, I've chosen really as a bit of an example of the battle that was going on in cities like Newcastle between the old and the new. So this is what Eldon Square looked like in the 1860s. It was a three-sided Georgian terrace designed by another architect, John Dobson, built by Richard Granger. Various other architects were involved. It's quite a complex story, but that's what it looked like. So it was a pretty iconic set of buildings in the middle of Newcastle. And this shot on the left is what Ursula captured as the city was starting to be reshaped. So this is in the midst of two sides of the terrace being demolished. So that was sort of quite, it was to make way for what became the Eldon Square shopping centre. So that was quite a sort of poignant shot, and probably historically from a photography point of view, it's one I'm pretty sure she would have been aware of. What was coming into Newcastle is the shot on the right. This is Cruddas Park, which is a series of tower blocks that were built and very much were the new Newcastle, a Newcastle that was trying to get rid of housing that was insanitary, unfit for human habitation. There's obviously then a big debate about what has happened subsequently in terms of those those buildings and tower blocks, and that's probably another talk. But it just gives you a flavour photographically of what was going on. The man at the centre of shaping Newcastle in the 60s and 70s will be known to some of you. T. Dan Smith was the Labour leader of the City Council, so they were sponsors of the Oriel Newcastle Guide. And he and his supporters had a vision of Newcastle summed up in the phrase Brasilia of the North, the idea that the city could harness the best architects from around the world and the buildings could reflect all that. So we could do a whole section on T. Dan Smith, but he was a really important figure, but very controversial even to this day in the way that Newcastle looks today. But what, as a researcher, I wasn't expecting, this is Belgrove Terrace, which is where Ursula Clark's family lived. And she took this photograph. It's included in the book, which is in the Newcastle. It's in the 19th century section. It was built in the 1860s. So she was aware of the history of Belgrove Terrace. So I'm looking through electoral register records, and I call up Belgrove Terrace. This is for 1965. And there I found the Clark family, and they're living next door to T. Dan Smith, the Labour leader of Newcastle City Council. Now, I'd love to be able to tell you about the relationship between the Clark family and the Smith family. I have nothing that I can bring you on that, but it just seemed to be quite amazing that Ursula Clark would be the neighbour of T. Dan Smith, where she's chronicling photographically the changing face of Newcastle as a city in front of her. One thing I can confirm is that the being neighbours may have opened a publishing door for Oriel, because what happened was that Oriel published in 1970 T. Dan Smith's autobiography. The story of T. Dan Smith ends unhappily in that he was caught up in the Paulson corruption scandal, and then he pleaded guilty to corruption charges and was jailed for 6 years. So that's probably another story in due course. I was saying to you earlier that Alsop had started his career architecture in Leeds, and so the Newcastle book was followed up by historic architecture of Leeds. This was Derek Lindstrom, who was a well-known, somebody who knew all about the architecture of Leeds. But one of the coups was they were able to get John Betjeman to do a preface for the book, so I'm sure that helped sales. And Betjeman had made a film in Leeds the previous year, which the BBC, for some bizarre reason, didn't run at the time. And Leeds Civic Trust, whose logo you see there, they were the sponsors of this book. They found a copy of this film, and it's now on the BFI website if anybody wants to see Leeds, which was my home city back in the 60s. Here's some of Ursula's work in Leeds in this particular book. The town hall I put up here because it's in the middle of a major refurbishment programme, and the organ on the right is part of that. So it's interesting to sort of architecturally to capture these images. This is Temple Mills in Holbeck, which in news terms very recently, there's been an announcement that the government's going to put £10 million into making it into the British Library North. As you can see, it's a building with Egyptian influences. This is built, I think, in the 1830s. And so these were a couple of Ursula's shots. The shot that ended up in the book, and this is why her archive's interesting in that some of the shots haven't been digitized, but this is the shot from the book, which takes in the lamp, which you probably saw in the other shot as well, and you get much more of a sense of the colonnades in front. When I saw this shot of Rain Brothers, Plumbers and Merchants on the left that Ursula had taken, I was immediately reminded of an image by Peter Mitchell, who's a photographer whose shots, particularly of Leeds, during the 70s and 80s. He's got an exhibition shortly, which is being unveiled and getting some publicity at the moment. And he used colour. So obviously what you get is a colour version of the same shot. But I just think it's interesting that Ursula, before Peter, was in the same spaces, recognising the value of these buildings and capturing them. And this is what the White Cloth Hall, as it actually is, built 1775, looks like today. So it's just reopened as an all-day food and drink hall. Scotland got its own book. George Hay, another celebrated architect and architectural writer, published 1969. The copy I managed to get signed by him. These are Ursula's photographs just in the middle of a period where Scotland was going through similar changes. So bottom left, you've got the Forth Road Bridge built in the late 50s, early 60s. And then on the bottom right, the plant house of Edinburgh Royal Botanic Gardens. All these have a modernist stamp, and you can see some of the tower blocks doing the same sort of thing. As a result, there was an Oriel book which captured all this architecture in Northern England, edited by Bruce Alsop. And Ursula was involved in capturing all these buildings. Many of them were civic buildings, schools, libraries, leisure centres, tower blocks. And this is a double-page spread from the sequence she took, which is just illustrating the civic centre in Newcastle. And as you can see, quite a distinctive building, which harnessed all sorts of architectural design inside, and also some pieces of artwork. It's quite a thing to see. And if you're in the centre of Newcastle, it's well worth a visit. This is another shot that Ursula took, slightly different angle, but you get a bit of a sense of the road furniture here and how quiet the roads are. They're just obviously starting to get the traffic to be able to run past. But what I didn't realise until visiting their offices, as were in Wrigley Place, is this is Wrigley Place 27, where Oriel's offices were, and they would have seen the staff, the Civic Centre being built just around the corner. So it's quite an interesting location from which to see the changing face of Newcastle. Historic Northumberland followed the Leeds publication, again, local sponsorship, Northumberland and Newcastle Society and the County Council this time. That's an Ursula shot on the front cover. And inside, just a couple of shots. The one on the left, Gibson's, this particular shot frontage was removed when the building was demolished in 1978 and is now in the Science Museum in London, where you can get a recreation of this particular shop as a chemist. But its roots are in a photographer from Hexham, J.P. Gibson. So I think Ursula would have been aware of that and wanted to capture that. Art Deco Cinema on the right, the Forum, which is still going today, and I went to a fantastic stereoscopy talk, which was held in there last year. If you look closely, you'll see that the film that was on was the Bond film on Her Majesty's Secret Service. So her photographs often have these little time capsules, little moments that tell you a little about when they were taken. Just as an example of all the acknowledgements, there's a bit of a sense here really of how collaborative this whole project was. I just draw your attention to that where the arrow is. Mr. Peter Chatfield was being thanked for his invaluable help in photography, transport and checking. And Ursula married Peter in June 1970. So like many of these sorts of projects, and we'll all, those of us who do research and photographic history, our families are often involved in helping the thing to happen. So I think that was an example here. So Peter is part of Ursula's team, as it were, going forward. The County Durham book followed in 1971. The chap on the right is the co-author, Neville Whitaker. He's kneeling in front of, this is Wynyard Hall. Wynyard Hall, Sir John Hall, who was one of the people who helped save Newcastle United back in the day when Kevin Keegan came to the club. And Ursula would sometimes just keep herself in shot. So her shadow is part of her photography, often just to give the shot a bit more space. And also, obviously, she's working with the sun behind her. So she pops up in that shot. And then the front cover of the Durham book, she's there in the shot on the right. And you can see really here what she's doing. Possibly she knew that this is Penshaw Monument, that this shot would be a front cover shot. So she's knowing that possibly there would be a title going across what is a field of turnips, the Historic England listing tells us. Sometimes feel with Ursula's photography that perhaps what you'd call her best photographs didn't make the books because either they weren't quite, the contrast was too great, or the sizing wasn't right, whatever it might be. This is just a wonderful shot across Durham that she took, featuring the cathedral, the castle, and there's just a sort of an air of mist or smoke. It's a bit difficult to tell, but it's just a wonderfully evocative photograph. The modernist and brutalist side of architecture in Durham is in this shot of Dunelm House and the Kingsgate Bridge, which was Ove Arup's. He was most proud of this particular structure, which straddles the River Wear. He was involved, of course, in the Sydney Opera House design. So to say that about one of his own designs, but this brutalist work, which is also in the Oriel Guide to Northern Architecture, is quite a sight to behold. It's really being celebrated at the moment in Newcastle in an exhibition called Concrete Dreams, the ideas that were being celebrated by architects who could use concrete to create these amazing structures. So we come to 1972, and there are cash flow problems for Oriel. And this story basically highlighted they needed £40,000 to keep going. In today's money, if the Bank of England inflation calculator I used is correct, it was around £450,000. So these are serious cash flow problems. But somebody came to the rescue. Routledge and Kegan Paul, a very well-known, long-established publisher from London, came in and took over Oriel. So the business was saved, but the irony, of course, was that Bruce also had wanted to be independent of publishers from London, and unfortunately that didn't happen, and Oriel were taken over. And the bookseller, September 73, just makes the point that the editorial offices are still going to be 27 Ridley Place, the small building that I showed you before. They'd been into bigger offices at 32 over the road in the much swankier building, and plans, they were going to expand from 11 to 40 staff. That never happened. So it's all a rather sad end to that project, really. The Historic England biography just reveals that Ursula Clark continued into the late 1970s, when Oriel ceased to exist following a takeover, and thereafter she provided occasional assistance to other organisations and authors. I can't give you any more detail about that because I have nothing to add, but what I can show you is what Routledge, Kegan Paul did with probably some of her and Bruce Alsop's finest work. This is the book that Ursula did with George Hay, the Architecture of Scotland. RKP brought a much bigger edition out, much bigger pages. You could see the photography better, and it highlighted a review which highlighted Ursula Clark's magic as a photographic editor. And I don't think there's any doubt she had real flair in that field. But her photography is also to the fore, and this is the front and back of a double edition, I suppose, of Northumberland and Newcastle, which brought those two books together. And the shot on the right is particularly fine, and just shows where she went to get some of these shots must have involved all sorts of hijinks. And then the final book that RKP produced, which was called English Architecture, used colour, and that's a shot by Bruce on the left rather. The shot on the right is actually by Peter Chatfield, Ursula's husband. It's a church in Essex, and it was credited to him. And also the book on its flyleaf credited Ursula not only as photographer, photographic editor, but it called her a photographic historian. And I think in the context of what we've talked about, that's absolutely right. She was a photographic historian as much as an architectural photographer. There's the advert, the final ad for that book, 384 illustrations. Sad to say that this is a sad day, really, because it's 25 years to the day since Ursula died. We learned from her biography it was after a short illness, which is very sad because it wasn't many days after her 60th birthday. What I just wanted to do finish was to highlight the fact you can go and look at Ursula's photography in the Ursula Clark Collection. That's on the Historic England website. There's some examples. You'll get that on the homepage. And then you can go from there and really search whatever you fancy, if it's a place you think she might have photographed. Just wanted to finish with a few images that show really the range of her photography, and perhaps just will enable us to, I'd like to do more research really about the range of her photography and some of the photographers who were operating this time. And I think, you know, she paved the way for in many ways. This shot seems to me to be a bit redolent of a fantastic photographer, Faye Godwin. Just a real fantastic landscape with the sheep doing their thing in the foreground. But she's also captured some of the architectural signposting. But she was somebody who bumped into people when she was with her camera. And I'm just going to show you a series of images, really just for them to speak of the fact she was a flesh and blood photographer. And some of these images, I think, lead on to fantastic Northeast photographers like Sir Lisa Continen, Tish Merthyr, whose photography is currently, I think it'll be the #1 album, Sam Fender's album, which People Watching, which is out this week. Her photography is featured on the album covers. So a shot like this, an unidentified building, it says in the archive, you can see a chimney in the background. It's somewhere in County Durham. This is a shot taken on the quayside in Newcastle. The list of prices tends to suggest it was pre-decimal, so probably late 60s. And I love the little girl's face and her confidence looking at the camera and just leaning against the counter. The shot on the right is in the historic Newcastle. There's just 4 lads who are obviously working in a factory, skiving off or having a tea break or just enjoying the fact they've spotted a photographer outside, a little bit of Ursula's shadow in the bottom of the frame. But the shot on the left is a Roman Catholic church in Elsick, which is historic and really an important church. But while she's taking this photograph, some kids have found her. And I just think Ursula's captured a real moment with those children, and they've obviously enjoyed the moment. And this is a pub in Durham that no longer exists, been demolished since. And I think probably Ursula went in to get interiors here because you can see there's quite a lot of detail in the background. But she's come across this guy behind the bar and she just took a couple of shots, which I just think are lovely and just capture the guy. And he's obviously gone along with it. He's not posing particularly, but he's there. The final thing is really an appeal to see whether we can find the photographer, the only photograph we have of Ursula. And that's this woman on the right. We do know from Ursula's notes that her initials are MBW. So if anybody is able to help identify MBW, it would be fantastic to then put the credit for the photograph of Ursula on the left. If there's anything from this talk that has struck a chord with you or you want to contact me, I write a weekly photo history blog called Press Photo Man. All my contact details are on there. That's pressphotoman.com. I'm also on Instagram and Blue Sky now, where you'll be able to contact me or find me. And I'll be sharing some more of Ursula's images next week as part of the follow-up to this talk. Just to say thank you enormously, particularly to Peter Chatfield, who I've tried to find and locate, but without any success, I'm afraid. This is Ursula's husband. He donated her archive to Historic England shortly after she died. And it's only thanks to him that we were able to see all these images. And these organizations have been fantastic in just helping promote this talk and making people aware of what they're doing and the interest there is in the built environment still. So thank you very much indeed. I'm aware that we're pretty much running up to the end of our time. But if anybody has got any questions or any comments they want to leave in the chat box, I'd be very happy to follow those up afterwards. And just to say thank you very much indeed for coming out on a Friday evening. And I hope this talk will have done a little bit towards spreading the word about Ursula Clark and her place in the canon of photographic history. Thank you very much.